the string quintet, your current project, are we to assume that that's part of the string of events that began with the discipline concept in the early 80s?
Probably began years before.
まあ元はって言えば原点はって言えばそれとそれ以前だと思うんだ。
Yes, if you wished to date it specifically, it would be more closely seen as part of guitarcraft.
具体的な年代。
If you wished to see the antecedent for guitarcraft, you would have to go back to 1974, when King Crimson, the end of the Great Deceiver. At this time, when I left the music industry to find a different way. You would have to go back to 1967, when instead of going to university, I went into music to find a different way. You have to go back to when I was 11, when I had a sense that the guitar was my life. Could go further back, but this illustrates the general principle that whenever one looks for a beginning, it escapes.
When you're talking about going back to finding the roots of something, are we discussing discipline here or the string quintet? Are the two exclusive of one another, or can you trace them back to the same thing?
Yes, I can trace them back to one particular moment in my life, which we haven't reached yet. But all right, it was the moment when I woke up alive in my body. I was in a pram, probably 6 to 9 months old, and I had a certain experience which has stayed with me throughout my life and has coloured everything since.
Excuse me, what's a pram?
A perambulator.
Uh-huh.
You know, pram is with babies.
Uh-huh.
You stick them in there to wheel them around.
Oh, I see. Uh-huh. And you had an experience
of becoming
aware of
being alive inside a body,
uh-huh.
and that whoever I am, it was not this creature that I inhabit. You understand? Mm-hmm. So that was my beginning point in this life. Why I hesitate before putting this forward as an answer to your question about the string quintet.
まあ今ストリング
その概念そのものだから自分の音楽その81年ではなかったのかなという。
You can trace the concept of discipline back to when you were a baby. However, you actually gave it a name in 1981, though.
Yes.
As a concept. Okay, I just wanted to clear that. Okay,
それまでは非常に曖昧。
So until that time, your awareness of that concept was rather vague then, or you just didn't have a name for it?
Are those my only two alternative answers?
No, of course not.
So what is the question?
Well, what sort of awareness did you have of that concept before you actually gave it a name?
I began concerning myself with the practice of discipline as such when I began to play the guitar, when I was 11. And as my experience and practice developed, so my sense of what was involved naturally deepened. Experience is simple and direct. There are no words involved in a direct experience. Then as one reflects upon it, seeks to formulate it, perhaps does an interview to talk about it, then one has to find a medium to express this sense. Verbal formulations have come about as a result of doing interviews over a period of 23 years. It's unreasonable to expect an interviewer to give their time to a musician who says nothing more than there is a danger in talking about experience, that the experience gives way to the description of the experience. If one talks about a direct experience, there's the danger of losing the contact with the experience and developing the experience with a formulation or description of the experience.
I see. In the interest of, so he's expounding on his own personal interpretation right here. It's not really a question. He was just saying that rock as a genre is more talked about, that has been talked about more than any other music probably ever. And its musicians are called upon to talk about their music more than any other musicians are. And it is in these discussions that a lot of the concepts become clarified. And that's one thing that makes rock unique. And you, as a musician within that genre, are faced with the duty of, I guess, aggressively addressing these issues. So he's hoping that you sort of take that attitude in this interview.
The question is its answer.
Oh, this particular question?
Any question.
Oh, any question.
The question is its answer.
Yeah.
Responsibility back to the gentleman.
You have stated from before, and I may misquote you here, or he may have misquoted you, but the music itself does not belong to the performers or the composers. Music is an entity unto itself. And in that respect, King Crimson is not the music of Robert Fripp. It's just King Crimson. It exists on its own.
If the music sucks, it belongs to the musicians.
So
it sucks and is very well presented, it belongs to the record company. So when music comes to life, it's quality which can't be contained, but it can be expressed, experienced in the moment.
So why do you maintain exclusive rights to the name King Crimson?
To enable the work of King Crimson to continue.
Like he was telling me, just let Mr. Fripp go on. So if you want to elaborate, don't wait for my interpretation.
That's the answer. For example, with the Yes reunion, the name of Yes belonged to Chris Squire as a trading entity, and the other 4 members of the band couldn't access the name. This is where a qualitative impulse, a creative impulse, becomes enmeshed in the conditioned world.
Yes, Mohammed.
King Crimson doesn't belong to me, but I pretend to own the name King Crimson so that the work of King Crimson's music can continue in the world.
What would you do if Greg Lake or John Wetton claimed rights to the Crimson name and went out on the road with it?
All these musicians, virtually everyone who has ever appeared in King Crimson, within the past several months have asked me to reform their version of King Crimson.
You mean, within the past, like this year?
Yeah. Virtually everyone who's ever been in King Crimson. My interest in King Crimson is in King Crimson as a work in progress, rather than a reconstitution of the past. My relationship with these musicians is good, but in terms of King Crimson, the next step in King Crimson, these musicians are not likely to give me a lawsuit. I was working for John Wetton on his new album in Los Angeles 5 weeks ago.
Saying they have no place in the ongoing project.
That's right. My position is that I'm happy to work with any of the former members of King Crimson on any of their projects. And if there were a sound musical basis for these musicians to work together, then I would support it. But the substance of King Crimson's musical life would appear to be moving forward rather than looking backwards. From the past, who has contemplated legal action against me. But in a legal document in 1983, which was presented to him by the management of King Crimson, he signed away his right to the name. It was an illegitimate act of the management and not in the interest of the artist that they purported to represent. Bill Bruford.
Oh, I see.
I ask you not to mention his name out of a professional courtesy. This is, if you're looking at the business of King Crimson, EG management behaved very illegitimately towards its artists. They used the money from the music company and the exploitation of the artists to develop ancillary business interests, including a property company, also a security company. The property company went into financial difficulties in 1989. Throughout 1990 they had difficulties giving the artists their money because they used the artists' income to support their property company. In 1991 they were completely unable to pay their artists money at the beginning of the year and sold the record company to Virgin in April 1991 and the publishing company to BMG, the German firm, in July 1991. I am at the moment in dispute with EG. I'm suggesting that they abused the trust which their artists placed in them. This situation of Bill Bruford in 1983 is only one small example of where they failed to act in their artists' interests. There is a major conflict of interests that they manage the artists for their own record company and publishing company. This would now be looked upon as an unethical relationship. Are they representing their artists or are they representing their publishing and record companies? The answer is quite clear. They use their artists to supply themselves with product in order to support their other business interests. My life from April 91 to April 92 was completely involved with fighting EG. It is now only 30% of my life.
Just as Bill Bruford was apparently concerned with the Crimson name, you have repeated thus far.
Bill was not concerned with the Crimson name. And on this, as a professional courtesy, I must ask you not to mention Bill specifically. You understand? This has to do with professional respect.
Right.
A concern of the only musician who was considered legal action against me was not concerned with the King Crimson name. They were concerned that they were not chosen to participate in the next presentation of King Crimson. Their concern was therefore not primarily a business concern, but a musical one. When a marriage breaks up, the marriage settlement often has really to do with money, but reflects perhaps a sense of umbrage. For example, in 1974, when King Crimson ceased to exist, and my choice was to follow a different course. My plan was to replace myself with Ian MacDonald from the first King Crimson, so that there was a direct line of descent within King Crimson. And then I would then leave, but the musicians within King Crimson and the road team would continue as King Crimson, in which I would have no interest. However, EG management at that time said they were not prepared to deal with any King Crimson of which I was not a member. I give this as an example to show that I view this somewhat differently.
This most recent incarnation of Crimson, then, it seems like it wouldn't have to be King Crimson. What makes it necessarily? Why do you have to use that name? Why couldn't it be something else?
If we drink coffee, why not call it tea? Water, why not call it coffee? Usually to do with recognizing a distinctive quality. If the quality is present, it's recognizable and can be named. A Robert Fripp band would not be King Crimson. Sure. If there is a Robert Fripp band, this is not King Crimson. If there were King Crimson, it would not be a Robert Fripp band. The Robert Fripp band is the Robert Fripp band. King Crimson is King Crimson. How is this so? I say, well, here's a cup of tea, here's a cup of coffee, taste them. The tea is different.
I guess it could be that this thing that you recognize as King Crimson is something maybe
it's not a thing, it's a quality.
Okay, quality. A quality that perhaps only you recognize.
No. People that buy King Crimson records buy King Crimson records.
So no guy were to be exposed to this new incarnation of King Crimson and say, that's the Robert Fripp band, he would be largely mistaken.
He would, and I do not believe this gentleman is that silly.
Okay, well the point he was trying to get at is that the criteria involved in evaluating this certain quality is perhaps something only you possess.
Can you recognize?
Do you think that Pink Floyd, post Roger Waters' Pink Floyd, is still a Pink Floyd?
I don't make comments on other working artists. Commentator, what do you think? I support the work of musicians. It is hard enough without me commenting on it. The man who is currently managing Roger Waters is one of the two members of EG Management, Mark Fenwick, with whom I am locked in dispute. More about Roger Waters' manager than I do Roger. More than Roger knows.
74, 1981, you had gone into sort of a personal seclusion.
For 3 years this was so.
Oh, 3 years.
Yeah.
Could you clarify which years?
Sure. I spent 1974 preparing to retreat. The next year, 75 to 76, in retreat. The next year, 76, 77, emerging from retreat.
I see.
And at that point, I went to live in New York at the beginning of 1977, with no idea what the future would present, but with no intention of returning to music.
I see. And the question was, were those years of mental and emotional duress for you?
Every year has been a year of mental and emotional duress for me. Why single out those years?
Because of the personal retreat. You used that word specifically.
No, every year is like that.
But that wasn't particularly characterized by duress of that nature, those 3 years.
They are all like that. It depends if you shrink from living or not. If you embrace life, that's what it's like. 1973 and 74 were wretched years. But there were remarkable parts too. 1981 was one of the most personally painful years of my life. But the question is whether one can employ this friction in a valuable way. And there are subtleties in this.
hard to imagine you in like in emotional pain, but in a very sort of physical way, like pounding your fists against the wall, pulling your hair out at the roots.
Well, that's stupid.
Mm-hmm.
It's a waste of energy.
Mm-hmm. So you internalize.
I have greater intelligence. No, I didn't say I internalize it. But the final comment was there are subtleties involved in this.
Okay, yeah.
If one walks through fire, one doesn't have to jump up and down on the coals. You can keep walking.
Okay. How does that apply to the subtleties and you're not expressing your...
It has to do with energy.
Mm-hmm.
The quality, quantity and intensity of one's personal energies. And to bang pillows will release a large amount of energy. So you will then be depleted. That doesn't mean you'll be relaxed. It means you don't have any energy to do anything. It means you've collapsed.
I see.
If, however, you use this large amount of low-grade energy, but concentrate it and refine it, it can be more like an oxyacetylene torch.
Pardon me, what?
An oxyacetylene torch?
What's that?
If you cut through plate steel, you use
I see. So
this very finely focused fire.
Mm-hmm.
It's like if you wanted to heat water, you could use hundreds of candles over a period of many years, and you would never reach an intensity at which the kettle would boil. But if you took all that candle power within the period of perhaps 3 minutes and focus it, there will be a chemical transformation.
I see.
81
年 The year that you confiscated his list of questions was the year that Discipline first came out. And you said at the time, it was very memorable to him, that this would be the year of Robert Fripp, and also the year of great commercial success for the band. It seems like that level of commercial success was maybe not reached.
Discipline is still selling.
Mm-hmm.
Has sold without a break in the past 13 years.
Is that right, really?
11 years. Yeah, sure.
Uh-huh.
例えば
Excuse me. If that amount of sales had been concentrated in 1 year, do you understand?
That's right. I see.
Yeah. And for me, it was a very memorable year. Not perhaps in ways which would be visible to other people, because I wasn't jumping up and down and banging pillows, but certainly for me.
So he said he was comparing it to, say, the success in the court of
The Crimson King.
King,
Sure.
the Crimson
Sure.
King. I guess compared it against that, maybe the level of success was not quite as high.
In terms of sales, In the Court of the Crimson King remains a classic, sure.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. It sold 50,000 in the first year of the CD re-release in 1990 after I remastered it. It sold like a new album.
Mm-hmm.
In America alone, that was.
ということはそのディスプリンの商業
Soもうさっき答えた. You are happy with the sales of Discipline then? That's the final question.
It's not my concern. My concern is the piece of work. And then to release it, and people decide whatever level it rises to. That's not my concern.
But I think he was just reflecting back on your original statement that it would be a major commercial success. And
hey, I believe it was.
okay, yeah, that's all I wanted to hear.
Yeah.
満足してると
So,
Yeah. There are still musicians that live off records from 22 years ago. Yeah.
でまた
you also commented to the effect that Beatles and Jimi Hendrix were good examples of popular music, and that in contrast to that, there was something called mass music, which is something different. Do you think King Crimson has succeeded in becoming popular music along the lines of the Beatles and Jimi Hendrix?
I doubt it.
Mm-hmm.
No. If you looked at the catalogues for the Beatles and the sales of the Beatles and the sales of King Crimson, well, obviously not.
But you're shaking your head as kind of a meaningless.
Commercial, well, I mean, commercial success for a musician means you earn a living for playing music. You don't play music to earn a living. If you do, you have major problems. Illegitimate concerns for the musician.
Uh-huh.
The concern is the piece of work and to be oneself. And it rises or falls to the level to which it rises and falls.
Mm-hmm.
If one is concerned with the level of sales, this is not music, this is merchandising. It's legitimate in its field, but it's not the proper concern of the musician. You have businessmen who are also musicians, but you don't have musicians that are also businessmen.
I see. I'm wondering though, let's compare fine arts against pop culture. And a lot of the music that he has liked over the years can be considered not fine arts, but rather pop culture. And he thinks that it stood as a breakthrough because the artists actually did concern themselves with reaching a larger mass of people, with reaching a larger audience. In fact, merchandising their product. He thinks there was that sort of attitude on the part of the musicians, and therefore became part of pop culture and became something large and something great. Is that you don't think that type of thing exists?
Oh, I think it does.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, I mean, you can see this happening. The question is whether the particular artist considers this to be a legitimate part of their work. For example, if the musician is making a record, it is an inherent part of the relationship with the record company that the artist will also sell the record. That means they'll do interviews and some form of promotional work. If, as an artist, one is not prepared to accept that, you will not make records. And that's how it is. So the question is then, can the interviews I undertake be a legitimate part of my work as a whole? And for me, they are, because of the particular approach to my work which I take, which, if you want it in a sentence, it's as a form of education. So I embrace a wider aspect to my work than purely the musical dimension. The question, if one is applying value judgments or criteria of quality, is simply, is this work true? Does the interview, for example, reflect the same concerns that are adopted in the work of music? Otherwise, no.
Okay, the reason he asked the last question about artists within so-called pop culture adopting the attitude of reaching sort of a mass audience is because he thought the discipline failed to a certain degree in that respect. He says that the concept of the album, the type of rhythms used, the concept of it and the rhythms were completely new, unprecedented. Okay, can you say this?
Sure.
They said what it seemed to lack was, and you probably take exception to this, but melody and commerciality. And lacking those two elements there, maybe it sort of slipped from the mainstream of pop culture and was not as accepted as it could have been, or maybe as it should have been. And he wants to know, is he way out of line here, and are these going to be concerns in the latest carnation of King Crimson?
It doesn't work like that. Let me give you one small example. I was in the Red Carpet Club in Los Angeles airport 4 weeks ago, en route to New York, and there were some young people around me that I thought, these guys are in rock and roll. I didn't recognize them, and I was reading a book, and one of the voices said, "Mr. Fripp." I looked up, and he said, "Richie Sambora." He said, "Can you remember King Crimson rehearsing in New York?" Yes, I did. He said, "I sat outside the door listening. Those rhythms you used."
Okay.
King Crimson did a live television show called Fridays in Los Angeles at the end of November, beginning of December 1981, on the way to Japan. Within the musical fraternity in New York, the musicians, this is what I was told, and I could mention a name or two, but I won't. I was told it set new standards for the quality of sound on television. The influence of that King Crimson was not directly on the audiences, but, and perhaps I'm being presumptuous in suggesting this, but on a number of other people who affected the audiences. In other words, you would have to take into account a multiplying factor and an indirect effect, which you're not going to see purely in terms of record sales.
I see.
Ask yourself how many people have actually read Plato, Aristotle, Nietzsche, Marx. All the people who have actually influenced anyone have never been read by anyone. I am not for a moment considering King Crimson on a level with that, but I am suggesting that the larger part of King Crimson's influence since 1969 has not been directly on the public. I know from among the musicians of my musical generation the influence King Crimson in 1969 had on other English bands at that period. I know the musicians that used to come to see us, and I know their record sales, and I know King Crimson's. And I know that the influence of King Crimson, purely in terms of 1969, can't be reflected in the sales of In the Court of the Crimson King.
Bill Scott.
I'm happy to say, if King Crimson has ever influenced anyone, I'm very happy with it. Plagiarism is one aspect, but being influenced is another. And the influence need not be that visible, simply that you see musicians who are giving it their best shot, and you say, "Hey, I'll give it one too." And finally, it's not up to the musician to make that decision. You present your work, and it goes wherever it goes. And if there is a qualitative impulse, very rarely will you see the direct relationship.
Yeah, you've answered it. So he sees two distinct periods in the history of the band. The first, and he's arbitrarily drawing these lines here. The first beginning with in the Court of the Crimson King and ending with Islands. The second being Discipline, and the two recordings that followed it, a total of 3 records. During these 2 periods, he saw a deterioration, what he thought was a deterioration of the quality. In both periods, similarly. Do you did you find that to be the same? And if so, what accounted for it?
Well, my sense of time periods was utterly different. When King Crimson broke up at the end of 1969, this band had begun at the top. And I knew that whatever happened for the next 2 years would be wrong from one point of view. On the other hand, it was inevitable. So, there was a working through that period, the bridging period. 1970 was primarily a studio period, merging to the live band of 71, which wasn't really satisfying. But that was necessary to move to the situation in 1972 and the formation of the five-piece, which, although never completely satisfying, as evidenced on The Great Deceiver, had some remarkable moments which, if you compare it to other live rock groups at the time, how many other bands were really going for it like that? And then you have 1981, and then something quite different. The same, but different.
When you say the same, what do you mean?
King Crimson.
But you don't see there was not that kind of deterioration, as he said. First of all, you're not agreeing with that outlook.
I'm not disagreeing. I'm not disagreeing with that. But my view of it is a different one. I would say that if I were to pass judgment on any piece of work, my own criteria has to do with the completeness and the integrity of the piece of work. And In the Court of the Crimson King was a complete piece of work. It had parts that I would today dismiss, but nevertheless as a single piece of work it held up. Then Red as a single piece of work, although parts of it I would not have today, as a single piece of work stood up. And Discipline as a single piece of work stood up. So in terms of a sense of completeness, these would be my three albums. So anything apart from those three albums would, the word deterioration, I wouldn't use that word. For me, the word would be unsatisfying. They fail to satisfy to the same extent. But if one is concerned with a work in progress, this is what happens in a process.
So he was asking about the cause behind it, and you're just saying it's part of the process.
Of being a work in progress.
Right.
Yeah. Where you're going is how you get there.
今度はそんなことになる。
Okay, I think your answer probably nullifies the need for this question, but he was saying, in order to prevent the same thing from happening this time around, what do you plan on doing? So obviously there's nothing that can be done. You're going to work as you...
These aren't the questions which musicians ask themselves. He would say, I mean, I could ask you a question like, how are you going to avoid writing these questions in a faulty script? Are you going to calligraphy classes? Well, the question has no meaning. The questions are the questions, not the characters in which they're written.
He's writing a scenario that is not necessarily going to evolve.
It's not a question of what I have to do to avoid something terrible happening. For me, it's a question of what I'm going to do so that the music can emerge.
What compels you to continue to address music in such a positive manner without becoming cynical about the music scene?
Well, there's a number of possible answers to that. One is music has its own sustaining power. Another is purely an act of intelligence. To be cynical is death. So, do you wish to live or do you wish to die? My experience being managed by EG over a period of years would give me all the instruction I need in cynicism were I to wish to accept that. But music has its own sustaining power and affords the musician access to a world in which virtually none of the questions which have been asked today are ever presented. It's a series of good and interesting questions.
ありがとうございます。
Compliment. The string quintet, your current project, are we to assume that that's part of the string of events that began with the discipline concept in the early 80s?
Probably began years before.
まあ元はって言えば、その原点はって言えば、そのずっとそれ以前だと思うんだけど。
Yes, if you wished to date it specifically, it would be more closely seen as part of guitarcraft.
具体的な年代。
If you wished to see the antecedent for guitarcraft, you would have to go back to 1974, when King Crimson
actually gave it a name in 1981, though.
Yes.
As a concept. Okay, I just wanted to clarify.
それまでは非常に曖昧。
So until that time, your awareness of that concept was rather vague then, or you just didn't have a name for it?
Are those my only two alternative answers?
No, of course not.
So what is the question?
Well, what sort of awareness did you have of that concept before you actually gave it a name?
I began concerning myself with the practice of discipline as such when I began to play the guitar, when I was 11. And as my experience and practice developed of becoming
aware of
being alive inside a body,
uh-huh.
and that whoever I am, it was not this creature that I inhabit. You understand?
Mm-hmm.
So that was my beginning point in this life. Why I hesitate before putting this forward as an answer to your question about the string quintet.
まあ今ストリング
ただその
スプリング以外に
概念そのものだから自分の音楽その81年ではなかったのかなという。
You can trace the concept of discipline back to when you were a baby. However, you act.
The end of the Great Deceiver. At this time, when I left the music industry to find a different way. You would have to go back to 1967, when instead of going to university, I went into music to find a different way. I have to go back to when I was 11, when I had a sense that the guitar was my life. I could go further back, but this illustrates the general principle that whenever one looks for a beginning, it escapes.
原点どっちの原点
When you're talking about going back to finding the roots of something, are we discussing discipline here or the string quintet? Are the two exclusive of one another, or can you trace them back to the same thing?
Yes, I can trace them back to one particular moment in my life, which we haven't reached yet. But All right, it was the moment when I woke up alive in my body. I was in a pram, probably 6 to 9 months old. And I had a certain experience which has stayed with me throughout my life and has coloured everything since.
Excuse me, what's a pram?
A perambulator.
Uh-huh.
You know, pram is with babies.
Uh-huh.
You stick them in there to wheel them around.
Oh, I see. Uh-huh. And you had an experience